Part 1. Cameron Brown. The outing begins without warning signs. A father drives along the coast with his young daughter for a quiet afternoon away from routine. The location is a scenic overlook where the land drops sharply toward the ocean. The air is calm. The path is uneven. The ground near the edge is rocky and narrow. There are no railings designed for children. There are other visitors close enough to observe what happens next. Only one adult is present. Only one child is present. The edge of the cliff stands between them and a drop that cannot be reversed. By the end of the day, the child is no longer alive. She is found far below the overlook, at the base of the cliff. Emergency responders arrive to a scene that offers no witnesses and no recording devices. From the first moments, the case depends entirely on a single account. The father explains that his daughter was running. He says she moved faster than expected. He says she slipped and went over the edge before he could reach her. The explanation is simple and emotionally direct. Investigators do not immediately reject it. Accidents happen in natural spaces. Children move unpredictably. But the geography of the site introduces doubts that do not fade. The cliff is steep and unusually high. The ground near the edge is not smooth or sloped in a way that encourages a sudden slide. It is rough, uneven, and broken by stones. The distance from the path to the drop is short but visible. A child would have needed to move with speed and direction toward danger. Investigators walk the area and document the terrain. They measure angles and surfaces. The physical setting does not align easily with a simple fall. Medical findings deepen the uncertainty. Specialists examine the injuries and compare them to known patterns from accidental falls. They consider body position, impact points, and the way momentum behaves when a small body moves from a standing height into open space. The conclusions are cautious but consistent. The injuries do not fully match what would be expected if a child slipped while running near the edge. These findings do not prove intent on their own, but they prevent the case from closing. Time passes and the investigation expands. Background details begin to matter. Court records reveal a dispute that existed away from the cliff. The child's mother had requested financial support. The amount discussed was substantial for the father's circumstances. The request created tension that had been ongoing. Prosecutors later argue that the obligation was seen not as temporary assistance but as a long-term burden. This financial element does not appear dramatically. It surfaces through documents, messages, and testimony. It is presented as pressure rather than rage. The theory suggests a quiet resentment rather than an impulsive act. According to the state, the child became associated with a cost the father did not want to carry. The argument is uncomfortable and deeply unsettling, but it becomes central to how the case is framed. Legal proceedings stretch across years. The first trial does not reach a decision. Jurors cannot agree. Evidence is revisited. Experts are questioned again. A second trial ends the same way. The absence of a verdict leaves the case suspended in public memory. The child's death remains unresolved. Each delay increases scrutiny rather than reducing it. During this period, the physical facts do not change. The cliff remains the same. The terrain does not soften with time. The medical conclusions remain steady. What evolves is the narrative. Prosecutors refine their focus. They emphasize the lack of signs that the child wandered on her own. Responding officers recall no footprints suggesting independent movement toward the edge. Specialists discuss the trajectory of the fall and the starting point required to reach where the body was found. The third trial concentrates on motive, opportunity, and the physical environment. The prosecution argues that the child was carried to the edge and pushed. The defense maintains that the incident was an accident amplified by grief and misunderstanding. The jury listens to years of accumulated analysis. They hear from fall experts, medical examiners, and investigators who explain why the scene does not behave like an accident. The question of credibility becomes unavoidable. With no witnesses and no recordings, the jury must decide whether the single account can stand against geography and science. They must consider whether the explanation remains plausible when placed inside the measurable world. They must also weigh the financial dispute without allowing it to overshadow the physical facts. After many years, the process reaches an end. The jury returns a guilty verdict for the most serious charge available. They also agree that specific circumstances increase the gravity of the act, including a motive tied to financial gain and a method that involved calculated weighting. The sentence reflects the weight of those findings. The father is ordered to spend the rest of his life in custody without the possibility of release. Public reaction is divided but intense. Some focus on the length of time it took to reach a conclusion. Others focus on the idea that a legal obligation could become a motive for something irreversible. The case becomes a reference point in discussions about how disputes over responsibility can escalate when resentment replaces accountability. What remains is a landscape that looks peaceful to casual visitors. The cliff still draws people who want to see the ocean. The path still appears harmless. Yet the story attached to the location changes how it is remembered. It is no longer just a scenic overlook. It is a place where a single explanation was tested against years of scrutiny and ultimately failed. This case leaves behind unanswered emotional questions even after legal closure. It shows how silence and isolation can complicate the search for truth. It also demonstrates how small details, when examined patiently, can reshape an entire narrative. The calm beginning gives way to suspicion, and suspicion hardens into a conclusion that took many years to reach. If this case raised questions or challenged your assumptions, share what stood out to you and why in the comments below. The next part follows a dispute that moved from paperwork to irreversible consequences, and it begins immediately. Part 2, Keenan Turner. The conflict begins inside a courthouse, not a crime scene. A filing requests custody arrangements and financial support for a newborn. The paperwork is ordinary. The language is neutral. The process is designed to be civil and predictable. On paper, nothing about it suggests danger. Outside the courtroom, however, emotions do not follow the same structure. The request for support becomes a symbol rather than a number. It represents loss of control, public judgment, and a future shaped by obligations the father does not accept. According to court records, frustration grows with each step of the process. Instead of engaging through legal channels, resentment settles in. Conversations become tense. The dispute stops being about procedure and turns personal. Friends and relatives later describe a noticeable change in behavior. The father appears calmer in public settings but increasingly agitated in private exchanges. Messages become shorter. Responses become delayed. There is a sense that he is holding something back. Investigators later say this period is critical. It shows a pattern of withdrawal mixed with fixation on the dispute. The day of the incident does not arrive suddenly. It follows weeks of pressure and unresolved anger. The father goes to the home of the child's mother under the appearance of a normal visit. The apartment is occupied by family members. There is no forced entry. There is no immediate alarm. For a brief time, everything appears routine. This normality is deceptive. Prosecutors later describe the visit as deliberate rather than spontaneous. They argue that the setting was chosen because it allowed proximity without suspicion. The visit is framed as a pause before action, not a moment of reconciliation. The presence of family members does not deter what follows. A short absence changes the atmosphere. The father leaves the room and returns with a weapon. The shift is immediate and irreversible. Gunfire erupts inside the apartment. The mother of the child is struck while holding the infant. Her mother is also struck. A sister is injured but survives. The violence is sudden, chaotic, and confined to a small space. What follows adds another layer to the case. After the attack, the father gathers the legal papers related to the support dispute. He places them on a stove and sets them on fire. The flames spread quickly. Smoke fills the apartment. The act is interpreted by prosecutors as symbolic as well as practical. The documents that represented obligation are destroyed in the same space where the family was attacked. The fire creates immediate danger for those still alive inside the apartment. The surviving sister, despite her injuries, manages to escape with the baby. Neighbors respond to the noise and smoke. Emergency services arrive to a burning scene with multiple victims inside. 2 women do not survive. The baby is rescued. The sister becomes the central witness. Her account shapes the investigation. She identifies the attacker and describes the sequence of events. Her testimony is supported by physical evidence, including shell casings, burn patterns, and the remains of the destroyed documents. The case moves quickly because there is no question about identity. The focus shifts to motive and intent. Prosecutors present the dispute over child support as a key factor. They do not argue that paperwork caused the violence. They argue that the meaning attached to it did. The filings represented a future the father refused to accept. They argue that anger over financial responsibility became intertwined with control and pride. The defense does not deny the acts but challenges the interpretation of motive. They suggest emotional instability and poor decision-making rather than calculated intent. The jury listens to testimony from investigators, medical professionals, and fire experts. They hear how the fire endangered the baby and the injured survivor. They see how the timing of the attack aligns with the legal dispute. The presence of a surviving witness changes the tone of the trial. This is not a case built on inference alone. It includes direct observation from someone who lived through the event. Her testimony provides continuity from the calm beginning of the visit to the moment of escape. The jury hears her describe the fear, the confusion, and the effort it took to save the child. The verdict reflects the weight of the evidence. The father is found guilty on multiple counts, including the deaths of 2 people, injury to another, and actions that endangered a child. The sentence is severe. Decades of incarceration are imposed. The court emphasizes the seriousness of bringing violence into a domestic space and the additional harm caused by setting the fire. The case stays in public discussion because it challenges assumptions. Many people expect danger to announce itself clearly. This story shows how it can hide behind routine visits and familiar settings. The legal dispute appears minor to outsiders. Inside the conflict, it becomes a trigger. For the surviving family members, the legal outcome does not restore what was lost. It provides structure and accountability but not relief. The apartment is no longer just a home. It becomes a place defined by a single afternoon. The paperwork that once seemed abstract now carries a different weight. This case illustrates how unresolved anger can transform ordinary procedures into symbols of threat. It shows the danger of viewing responsibility as something to erase rather than manage. It also highlights the importance of the survivor's voice in establishing truth when events unfold quickly and without warning. If this story left you unsettled or raised questions about how disputes escalate, share your thoughts on what warning signs mattered most. The next part examines a case where doubt lingered for years before the truth was forced back into the light. Part 3, Donald Mills. The death is first described as an accident. A young mother is found unresponsive after a night of drinking. The initial explanation is simple and convenient. Authorities record that she choked and collapsed. The report closes quickly. To the outside world, the case appears resolved before questions can form. The family does not accept the explanation. They notice marks that do not fit the story they were given. They remember conversations that ended with tension rather than calm. They recall arguments about responsibility and money that never reached a stable resolution. Their doubts are quiet at first, shared privately, then repeated until silence becomes impossible. Time passes without answers. The official conclusion remains unchanged. The family keeps pushing. They request a second look. They ask for records. They speak to anyone willing to listen. What they have is not proof, only a sense that something essential has been missed. That sense refuses to fade. Eventually the case is reopened. The decision is not dramatic. It comes after persistence rather than discovery. Months after the burial, the body is examined again. This moment changes everything. The second medical review does not rely on assumptions made under time pressure. It focuses on detail and consistency. The findings contradict the original conclusion. Experts identify pressure injuries to the face and neck. They describe evidence that the airway was obstructed. A small detail becomes decisive. Material found deep in the throat suggests the face was forced downward. This is not consistent with an accidental collapse. It points to restraint and deliberate force. The new conclusions reframe the entire timeline. What was treated as a tragic outcome of drinking is now understood as a death caused by another person. The difference is not subtle. It is structural. The first report ends the story. The second begins an investigation. Attention returns to the men closest to her at the time. The relationship had been strained. They shared a child. Disagreements about financial support had grown sharper. Witnesses later describe arguments that centered on obligation and control. These details had been known before but were not pursued when the death was labeled accidental. Investigators examine the scene again through a different lens. They note attempts to shape perception after the death. A bottle placed in the victim's hand suggests an effort to reinforce the accident narrative. The staging is not elaborate, but it is intentional. It relies on expectations rather than scrutiny. The family's role becomes central. Without their refusal to accept the first answer, the case would have remained closed. They provide context investigators now understand differently. They describe the relationship dynamics. They highlight moments that once seemed minor. Their persistence supplies momentum where none existed. A trial follows. The courtroom hears two versions of the same death. The first is brief and familiar. The second is detailed and unsettling. Medical experts explain how the injuries align with smothering rather than collapse. They clarify why the original examination failed to identify these signs. The jury listens as small facts accumulate into a coherent picture. The defense argues confusion and panic rather than intent. They suggest that alcohol explains inconsistencies. The prosecution returns to the physical evidence. They show how pressure marks and airway obstruction do not occur by chance. They emphasize the staging effort as proof of awareness. The verdict confirms the second narrative. The man is convicted of causing the death. The decision brings relief to the family but not closure. Years have passed. The truth arrives late. It changes the official record but cannot return what was lost. Decades later the case resurfaces again when parole becomes possible. The family speaks publicly. They remind the board of the facts. They describe the impact that never diminished. The request for release is denied. The decision acknowledges the seriousness of the act and the deception that followed. This case demonstrates how easily an early conclusion can shape everything that comes after. It shows how speed can replace accuracy when assumptions go unchallenged. It also shows the power of persistence when institutions fail to ask enough questions. The emotional arc is slow and heavy. Doubt grows without support. Persistence replaces trust. Truth emerges only after time has taken its toll. The family pays the cost to ensure the record reflects reality rather than convenience. If this case changed how you think about early conclusions, share what detail made the difference for you. The next part explores a story where fame and financial fear collided long before the truth became public. Part 4, Rae Carruth. He is known to the public as an athlete at the height of his career. He wears a uniform associated with strength, discipline, and success. His life appears organized and controlled. Income is steady. Reputation is carefully maintained. To fans, he represents stability. Behind that image, fear begins to grow. The fear is not sudden. It develops quietly as personal responsibility approaches. A pregnancy brings expectations that cannot be managed with silence or distance. Financial obligations already exist from a previous relationship. Another child means another long-term commitment. According to court records, this prospect creates pressure rather than preparation. The public image becomes part of the conflict. Acknowledging the pregnancy would change how he is seen. It would connect his private life to public scrutiny. Prosecutors later argue that he feared loss of control more than the obligation itself. Money, reputation, and autonomy become intertwined. The solution he chooses is indirect. He does not act alone. Instead, he communicates with someone willing to do what he will not do himself. The plan is not complex, but it is deliberate. It relies on distance and deniability. The intention is to remove the problem without appearing responsible. On the night of the attack, the pregnant woman is driving. Another vehicle approaches alongside her. Shots are fired. She is injured but remains conscious long enough to make a call for help. That call becomes one of the most important elements of the case. Her voice records fear, confusion, and recognition. In the call, she identifies the person she believes is involved. She names him. She explains what she is seeing and where she is. These words are preserved. They outlive her. They later carry more weight than any written statement. Emergency responders arrive quickly. Doctors attempt to save both mother and child. The baby is delivered in an emergency procedure. He survives, but the lack of oxygen causes permanent damage. He will require care for the rest of his life. His survival becomes both a medical achievement and a reminder of what was taken. The mother does not recover. She dies weeks later from complications related to the attack. Her death transforms the case. What began as an attempted removal becomes a fatal outcome. The investigation shifts from assault to homicide. Authorities focus on communication records. Phone logs show calls between the athlete and the person who fired the shots. Timing aligns closely with the attack. Movement data places both men in positions that support coordination. The indirect nature of the plan begins to collapse under scrutiny. The shooter cooperates. He explains how the plan was discussed. He describes instructions and expectations. This testimony fills in gaps that technology alone cannot. Prosecutors argue that the athlete believed distance would protect him. Instead, it becomes evidence of planning. Financial records are introduced. They show existing obligations and projected costs. Prosecutors do not argue poverty. They argue resistance to responsibility. They frame the motive as avoidance rather than need. The image of success is contrasted with fear of obligation. The trial draws public attention. The athlete is no longer seen through highlight reels but through transcripts and recordings. The courtroom hears the emergency call. Jurors listen to the last words spoken by the woman. The call shifts the emotional center of the case. It removes abstraction and replaces it with immediacy. The verdict reflects a compromise between direct action and responsibility. He is not convicted of personally causing the death, but he is found guilty of arranging events that led to it. The sentence is long but not permanent. It acknowledges orchestration without physical participation. Years pass inside custody. Outside, the child grows up with significant medical challenges. Care is provided by family members who did not choose this responsibility but accepted it. The child becomes a living consequence of decisions made before his birth. The athlete is eventually released after serving his sentence. The release generates discussion rather than closure. Many view it as a reminder that legal punishment does not measure lifelong impact. Freedom for one contrasts sharply with limitation for another. The story does not end with a release date. It continues through medical appointments, assisted movement, and daily support. The child's condition is permanent. The decisions that caused it are irreversible. The imbalance between consequence and punishment becomes part of the public reflection. This case illustrates how power can distort judgment. Access to resources does not prevent fear. In this instance, it enables distance. The indirect approach does not reduce harm. It multiplies it by spreading responsibility across lives that did not consent. The emotional progression is clear. Confidence gives way to panic. Panic leads to planning. Planning leads to exposure. The collapse is not sudden but complete. Reputation, freedom, and legacy are all altered. What remains is a story where the most enduring impact is carried by someone who never had a choice. The legal system addresses guilt. Time addresses memory. The child carries the outcome every day. If this case made you reconsider how indirect actions can still shape irreversible outcomes, share which moment stayed with you the most. The next part examines a single decision that turned financial pressure into immediate and irreversible loss. Part 5, Andre Cole. The chain of events begins with a routine administrative action. A court order authorizes a portion of wages to be redirected toward overdue financial responsibility. The process is automatic. It does not involve confrontation or warning beyond paperwork. For the system, it is a correction. For the person affected, it feels like a public mark. The amount is not symbolic. It reflects months of unpaid obligation. The deduction appears on a paycheck without ceremony. It arrives as a line of text that changes the meaning of the entire day. According to court records, this is the moment when frustration crosses into fixation. Hours later, behavior shifts. Witnesses later describe agitation and anger that did not exist earlier that day. The timing becomes central to how the case is understood. The administrative action and the violent outcome occur within the same span of hours. Prosecutors later described this proximity as impossible to ignore. That evening, he goes to a home connected to his past relationship. The visit is not scheduled. It is not welcome. Entry is forced. The space inside is small and private. What follows unfolds quickly and without restraint. One person is seriously injured but survives. Another does not. The act itself is chaotic rather than calculated. There is no complex plan. There is no attempt at subtlety. Investigators later argue that this lack of planning does not reduce responsibility. Instead, it highlights the loss of control that defined the moment. Anger drives the sequence, not strategy. Physical evidence is extensive. Blood traces mark movement through the space. A weapon is recovered and linked through forensic testing. Injuries are documented and consistent with witness accounts. Neighbors report noise and disturbance. Their statements align with the timeline established by investigators. The surviving victim provides critical testimony. She describes the confrontation and the fear that followed. Her account is supported by physical findings. Together, they create a narrative that does not rely on interpretation alone. It is grounded in observation and material proof. After the incident, he flees the area. The departure is brief but meaningful. It suggests awareness rather than confusion. He later turns himself in. By then, the damage is complete. One life is gone. Another is permanently altered. During trial, the prosecution focuses on motive without overstating it. They do not argue that the administrative decision caused the outcome. They argue that it acted as a trigger for an existing inability to manage frustration. The timing is emphasized repeatedly. The jury is shown how quickly reaction followed action. Financial records are introduced. They show the order, the amount, and the date it took effect. These documents are presented alongside testimony describing the events of that evening. The contrast between bureaucratic language and human consequence is stark. The defense argues emotional distress and lack of planning. They suggest that the reaction was impulsive and not intended to result in death. The prosecution responds by returning to the facts. Intent is inferred from action and force, not from premeditation alone. The jury is instructed to consider responsibility rather than sympathy. The verdict is decisive. He is found guilty of the most serious charge available for the death, as well as additional charges related to the attack on the survivor. The sentence reflects both acts. It is the most severe penalty permitted under the law. Years pass as appeals move through the system. Legal arguments address procedure, jury selection, and mental state. Each challenge is reviewed and denied. Courts consistently affirm the original findings. The evidence is described as overwhelming. The length of the legal process does not soften the outcome. It reinforces it. Each ruling restates the same conclusion. The administrative action did not force the choice. It revealed how the individual responded to pressure. Eventually, the sentence is carried out. The case returns to public attention briefly. News coverage emphasizes the connection between unpaid responsibility and violent response. Commentators describe it as an extreme example of how anger over obligation can spiral. For the survivor, life continues with lasting effects. Physical recovery does not erase memory. For the family of the person who died, the outcome provides finality but not relief. The administrative system moves on. The human cost remains fixed. This case demonstrates how an ordinary decision can become a catalyst when emotional regulation is absent. It shows that consequences do not always unfold gradually. Sometimes they arrive in a single day and never leave. The emotional progression is sharp. Pressure builds silently. Reaction is immediate. The ending is permanent. There is no space for reversal once the moment passes. What remains is a cautionary example of how responsibility, when treated as an enemy, can provoke actions that destroy far more than the obligation ever required. If this case made you think differently about how pressure can trigger irreversible choices, share what part of the timeline felt most critical to you. The next part follows a story where planning replaced impulse, and the consequences reached even further. Part 6, Darren Boswell Johnson. The obligation is written in legal language, but it is interpreted as a personal threat. A court confirms paternity and assigns monthly responsibility. For most people, this marks the beginning of routine compliance. For him, it becomes an idea that dominates his thinking. Investigators later describe an obsession rather than resistance. He does not argue the amount. He searches for ways to make it disappear. The preparation is quiet and internal. There are no public outbursts. No visible confrontations. Instead, there is rumination. Digital records later reveal repeated online searches about avoiding financial responsibility. These searches are not accidental. They are specific and persistent. Prosecutors use them to show a mindset forming before any physical action occurs. This digital trail becomes one of the most important elements of the case. It shows intent developing over time. It demonstrates that the idea of escape existed before the final encounter. The obligation is framed not as a duty but as something to be removed entirely. This perspective shapes everything that follows. The morning of the incident begins like any other weekday. A mother prepares to leave with her young child. The setting is ordinary. A parking area. A short walk. Neighbors nearby. Nothing suggests imminent danger. This normality makes what follows more difficult to comprehend. He arrives early and waits. Prosecutors later argue that this waiting is significant. It suggests anticipation rather than chance. Witnesses report hearing raised voices. An argument unfolds about the legal order. According to testimony, he demands that the obligation be withdrawn. She refuses. The refusal is calm. The response is not. The confrontation escalates rapidly. Neighbors hear sounds that break the routine of the morning. Emergency calls follow. When responders arrive, both the mother and the child have been gravely injured. They are taken to the hospital. Despite efforts, neither survives. The loss is immediate and total. The absence of the weapon does not slow the investigation. Witness accounts place him at the scene. Video footage from the area supports the timeline. He admits being present during questioning. The digital searches provide context. Together, these elements form a coherent narrative without reliance on a single piece of evidence. Prosecutors build their case around motive rather than mystery. They argue that the obligation became a fixation. The idea of long-term responsibility transformed into fear and resentment. They show how the searches indicate planning. They explain how arriving early suggests preparation. The morning setting underscores deliberation rather than accident. The defense challenges the interpretation of intent. They argue emotional distress and panic. They point to the absence of the weapon. The prosecution responds by returning to behavior before the incident. They emphasize that preparation does not require complexity. It requires direction. The searches and timing provide that direction. Witnesses from the neighborhood testify. They describe the argument. They recall the sudden change in tone. Their accounts align. Medical professionals explain the injuries. Investigators outline the timeline. Each piece reinforces the others. The jury is presented with a case built on accumulation rather than speculation. The verdict reflects the clarity of the evidence. He is found guilty on multiple counts related to the deaths. The sentence is severe. It removes the possibility of release. The judge speaks about the gravity of taking 2 lives in a moment driven by refusal to accept responsibility. For the families involved, the outcome brings structure but not healing. The obligation that caused fear no longer exists. What replaces it is permanent absence. The child who was at the center of the legal process is gone. The mother who sought stability is gone. The loss extends beyond the courtroom. This case highlights how perception can distort reality. A legal requirement designed to support a child is reframed as a threat to identity. That distortion grows unchecked. Preparation happens internally. By the time action occurs, the individual believes there is no alternative. The emotional arc is narrow and intense. Obsession builds quietly. Tension peaks in a brief encounter. The result is a double loss that cannot be reconciled with the original obligation. What was meant to ensure care becomes the focus of destruction. Digital evidence plays a defining role. Searches that might seem abstract become windows into intent. They show how thoughts move toward action. In this case, the internet does not distract. It documents. What remains is a stark reminder that avoidance can feel easier than acceptance until consequences arrive. Responsibility delayed does not disappear. It transforms, sometimes into something far more damaging than the obligation itself. If this case made you think about how unseen preparation can be as important as visible action, share which detail stood out to you the most. The next part follows a meeting meant to resolve tension that instead marked the beginning of another irreversible outcome. Part 7, Quanmain Boyd. The meeting is framed as a conversation. It is described as a chance to talk things through, to reduce tension, to address concerns that have been building quietly. On the surface, there is nothing unusual about it. Two people who share children agree to speak face to face. The purpose sounds practical. The reality is fragile. Financial pressure sits beneath the discussion. Requests for support have created strain. Payments exist, but expectations have changed. Another child is expected. The future feels heavier than before. Family members later say the disagreement is not only about money but about control, timing, and fear of what comes next. On the morning of the meeting, the woman reaches out to a friend. Her messages do not express anger. They express unease. She says she does not feel safe. She says she is in a vehicle and cannot leave. The tone is urgent but restrained. These messages become the last direct record of her thoughts. Phone data later confirms the timing. The messages are sent close together. Location information places her near the men she intended to meet. Investigators treat this digital record as a timeline. It shows movement, proximity, and escalation. It replaces witnesses who were not present. A short time later, communication stops. Calls go unanswered. Concern spreads quickly among family members. When authorities locate her, the outcome is already final. The future she was preparing for is gone. The pregnancy, confirmed through items found at her home, becomes part of the loss. The investigation moves carefully. There is no public resolution yet. The suspect is identified based on messages, location data, and the context of the meeting. He is taken into custody. Formal charges follow. The legal process begins but does not conclude quickly. Prosecutors describe a mix of pressures. Financial responsibility intersects with emotional strain. The meeting is characterized not as spontaneous but as the result of unresolved conflict. They do not present a final narrative. They present evidence that suggests a path. The defense has not yet fully unfolded. The case remains open. What exists is a collection of facts waiting for judgment. Phone records show fear. Family statements describe tension. Investigators outline the sequence without speculation. The court has not delivered a verdict. This uncertainty shapes the emotional weight of the story. There is no closure to reference. There is only absence and anticipation. Loved ones speak about plans that will never happen. A classroom loses a teacher. Children lose a mother. Another child is never born. Digital evidence carries much of the story. Text messages become a voice preserved in time. They show how quickly concern can turn into alarm. They also show how help can be out of reach even when danger is recognized. The meeting that was meant to calm things instead amplifies fear. The promise of conversation becomes a moment of vulnerability. Trust, once extended, cannot be withdrawn fast enough. The gap between intention and outcome is sudden. Financial discussions are not presented as the sole cause. They are presented as part of a larger emotional landscape. Pressure accumulates. Communication fails. Decisions are made in private moments that leave public consequences. For the family, waiting becomes its own burden. Each hearing date carries hope and dread. Each new detail reopens wounds. The lack of resolution keeps the story active in their lives. Silence is not peace. It is suspension. This case illustrates how modern investigations rely on digital footprints. Messages and location data do not explain motive on their own. They show sequence and state of mind. They allow investigators to reconstruct moments that no one else saw. The emotional arc moves from unease to fear, then into a quiet that does not resolve. There is no clear ending yet. The story remains open, defined by what is known and what is still to come. If this case left you thinking about how final moments are sometimes preserved in small digital traces, share which details stayed with you and why. The next part follows a dispute that stretched across states and time, where planning replaced impulse and the aftermath revealed itself slowly. Part 8, Grant and Amanda Hayes. The conflict does not explode. It stretches. Months turn into years of tension tied to custody schedules, financial responsibility, and court filings that never seem to resolve anything. Each exchange adds weight. Each delay deepens resentment. What begins as a legal disagreement slowly reshapes daily life. The woman at the center of the dispute is focused on stability. She plans visits. She follows procedures. She expects predictability. Instead, she encounters resistance at every step. Messages become formal. Tone hardens. The dispute stops being about cooperation and becomes about endurance. By mid-year, the situation reaches a breaking point. She travels expecting a routine exchange involving her children. It is something she has done before. There is no sign that this trip will be different. She arrives near an apartment she has visited many times. Then communication stops. Concern rises quickly. Missed calls. Missed appointments. Silence that does not fit her habits. Investigators trace her last known movements to the apartment shared by her former partner and his new spouse. From that moment, the focus narrows. The theory that emerges is not one of panic. It is one of coordination. Prosecutors later argue that two people made a decision together. Not in a moment of chaos, but with calculation. The act itself happens in private. What follows becomes the most revealing part of the case. Instead of seeking help or attempting concealment through isolation, the pair focus on logistics. A rental vehicle is obtained. Supplies are purchased. Phone records and receipts document movement. The steps are deliberate. Each choice extends the distance between the act and discovery. The journey crosses state lines. This is not incidental. It requires planning, time, and agreement. Investigators later describe the route as purposeful rather than random. The length of travel suggests confidence that the plan will succeed. In a remote area far from the original location, remains are discovered in water. Recovery is difficult. Conditions complicate identification. Forensic work takes time. Eventually, the remains are confirmed to belong to the missing woman. The condition of the body indicates intentional dismemberment after death. This discovery transforms the investigation. What was initially a missing person case becomes a homicide involving transportation across jurisdictions. Federal authorities become involved. The scope widens. Resources increase. Pressure intensifies. Attention returns to the couple. Their movements align with the timeline. Their explanations shift. Inconsistencies appear. Evidence accumulates through travel records, rental agreements, and digital data. The narrative of cooperation collapses. Prosecutors describe the partnership as central. One person does not act alone. Each supports the other. Decisions are shared. Responsibility is mutual, even if actions differ. The concept of accomplice liability becomes critical. The trial focuses heavily on what happened after the death. The act itself is reconstructed through inference. The aftermath is documented. This distinction matters. It shows intent through behavior rather than confession. It shows calm where panic might be expected. Expert testimony explains how evidence was handled and moved. Investigators outline how materials were acquired and disposed of. Each step is presented as a choice rather than a reaction. The jury is asked to consider whether such sustained effort is possible without agreement. The emotional tone of the case is stark. There are no sudden outbursts captured on record. There are no frantic calls for help. What exists is quiet coordination. This absence of chaos becomes its own form of evidence. The verdict reflects the gravity of that coordination. One receives the most severe sentence available, ensuring permanent separation from society. The other receives a lengthy sentence reflecting participation and concealment. Appeals do not alter the outcome. The children involved are placed with relatives. Their future is reshaped without their consent. The legal dispute that began the process is resolved only after everything else is gone. The irony is not lost on the court. This case illustrates how prolonged conflict can erode boundaries. When disputes last long enough, solutions can shift from negotiation to elimination. The legal system becomes something to escape rather than engage. The investigation demonstrates the power of interconnected data. Receipts, phone records, vehicle logs, and forensic analysis converge. No single piece tells the story. Together, they remove all doubt. The emotional progression is methodical. Planning replaces anger. Detachment replaces hesitation. Collapse arrives not through a single mistake but through accumulation. Each detail reinforces the last until denial is no longer possible. What remains is a case defined less by the act itself and more by what followed. The effort to erase evidence becomes the strongest proof of intent. Distance does not protect. It exposes. The dispute that began with schedules and payments ends with irreversible separation. Responsibility is no longer debated. It is enforced in the most final way available to the system. If this case made you think about how long-term conflict can quietly turn into something calculated and destructive, share which moment changed how you saw the story. The next part moves to a case where a single court decision was followed by a disappearance that forced investigators into a race against time. Part 9, Michael John Wolfe. The legal decision is small in scale but heavy in meaning. A judge confirms paternity and assigns a modest monthly obligation. On paper, it is routine. The amount is limited. The language is procedural. Yet the timing compresses everything that follows. The ruling lands, and the response window is narrow. Within days, communication patterns change. Messages slow, then stop. A mother and her young child vanish from ordinary routines without preparation. The home shows signs of interruption rather than departure. Essential items remain. Appointments are missed. Family members sense danger not from noise, but from absence. Investigators establish a tight timeline. The court ruling is logged. Phone activity is mapped. Work schedules are checked. Movements before and after the disappearance are tracked minute by minute. The sequence is brief, decisive, and difficult to misread. There is no long gap where uncertainty can hide. Digital evidence becomes the spine of the case. Location data places the father near the home around the time communication ends. Messages show no plans to travel. Surveillance captures vehicle movement along routes that lead away from populated areas. The data does not speculate. It shows proximity, direction, and duration. Search efforts expand quickly. Wooded areas are prioritized based on travel patterns and timing. Investigators focus on places where isolation aligns with opportunity. The terrain complicates recovery. Distance stretches time. Silence deepens concern. The longer the search continues, the more the outcome feels predetermined. Physical evidence begins to surface. Items linked to the missing pair are found along remote paths. Each discovery narrows the search radius. The timeline tightens further. The margin for alternative explanations disappears. What remains is confirmation rather than surprise. When remains are located, the case changes from search to reconstruction. Medical findings establish cause consistent with deliberate harm. The setting confirms isolation. The absence of defensive indicators suggests control rather than chaos. The sequence aligns with the digital record. The story told by data matches the story told by the landscape. Prosecutors present the case as a study in reaction speed. They argue that the ruling triggered a decision rather than a debate. The closeness in time is emphasized. The actions do not unfold over weeks. They unfold over days. The compression supports intent without relying on confession. The defense evaluates risk. The evidence is layered and consistent. Digital trails intersect with physical findings. Witness testimony fills remaining gaps. The possibility of a harsher outcome looms if the case proceeds to full trial. A strategic decision is made. A guilty plea follows. It is framed as acceptance rather than explanation. By admitting responsibility, the defendant avoids a more severe scenario. The plea does not soften the facts. It acknowledges them. The sentence ensures permanent custody. Release is removed from consideration. For the families, the plea delivers certainty without comfort. The timeline is closed. The search ends. The questions stop multiplying. What remains is a cold clarity. The obligation that prompted fear no longer exists. The people it was meant to support are gone. The case demonstrates how speed can define intent. There is no long build-up captured on record. There is a ruling, a brief interval, and irreversible action. The absence of hesitation becomes its own evidence. Silence speaks through timestamps. Investigators emphasize the importance of convergence. No single element proves the case alone. Phone records without recovery would leave doubt. Recovery without data would leave gaps. Together, they remove ambiguity. The timeline holds. The emotional arc is restrained. There are no dramatic confrontations preserved. There is quiet movement followed by disappearance. Public concern rises as days pass without answers. The conclusion arrives without spectacle. It is final and unmoving. This story leaves little room for reinterpretation. The reaction window is too short. The evidence is too aligned. The plea confirms what the timeline already showed. Responsibility is accepted because it cannot be denied. The lesson is stark. Small decisions can carry outsized weight when paired with refusal to accept consequence. Time does not always dilute intent. Sometimes it concentrates it. Here, hours matter more than years. If this case shifted how you think about timing and intent, share which detail in the sequence felt most decisive to you. The next part examines a case where warnings were voiced in advance, yet the outcome still unfolded in public view. Part 10, Mark Morris. The warnings are sent before anything happens. They are not vague. They are not hidden. Messages describe fear and escalating behavior. Threats are reported through official channels. The intent is prevention, not accusation. The system receives the information, logs fragments of it, and moves on without urgency. The dispute centers on financial responsibility for a child after separation. The process follows formal steps. Requests are submitted. Case notes are created. On the surface, procedures are followed. In practice, risk is underestimated. Signals that should trigger protection are treated as routine conflict. The woman reaches out more than once. She explains that the discussion about financial support has turned hostile. She reports threatening language. She asks for help navigating a process that now feels unsafe. According to later reviews, these contacts are not escalated. Key details are not fully recorded. Risk assessments are incomplete. This failure is quiet. There is no single moment where someone refuses to listen. There is a series of small omissions. Each one seems manageable on its own. Together, they remove the chance to intervene. By the time danger becomes visible, it is already close. The morning of the incident is public. It is early. A residential street. Parents and children moving through routine. The woman is walking with her child toward school. There is no expectation of confrontation. The setting is ordinary and exposed. He appears suddenly. Witnesses later describe urgency and aggression. She recognizes him and reacts immediately. She tries to escape. She seeks help from a passing vehicle. Her response shows awareness of danger and an attempt to avoid it. There is no confusion about intent in that moment. The attack unfolds quickly. It happens in view of others. People nearby respond, but the harm is already done. Emergency services arrive within minutes. Despite efforts, she does not survive. Her child is taken to safety. The contrast between public space and private violence shocks the community. The investigation uncovers a trail that was visible before the incident. Messages sent in the days and weeks leading up to the morning show fixation and anger. Threats are documented. Social media posts reinforce the pattern. None of this is new. It is all dated before the event. Prosecutors present the case as one where prevention was possible. They do not argue that the system caused the act. They argue that it failed to recognize risk when it was clearly expressed. The legal focus remains on the individual, but public attention shifts toward institutional responsibility. The defendant pleads guilty. The evidence is not disputed. The sentence reflects the seriousness of the act and the planning implied by prior threats. The courtroom decision is decisive. Yet it does not end the conversation. It begins another one. A government review follows. The findings are critical. They identify missed opportunities to assess danger. They note failures to follow safeguarding procedures. They conclude that warning signs were present and not acted upon. The language is careful but firm. This review changes the scope of the case. It is no longer only about a single morning. It becomes a reference point in national discussion about how systems respond to reported fear. Advocacy groups cite it as evidence of gaps between policy and practice. For the family, the outcome is layered. There is accountability for the act itself. There is also recognition that earlier intervention might have changed the trajectory. This possibility does not bring comfort. It adds another dimension to loss. The emotional arc is stark. The initial stage is a request for help. It is measured and procedural. The middle stage is silence from those expected to respond. The final stage is a public tragedy that forces attention. This case demonstrates how risk is not always hidden. Sometimes it is stated plainly and still minimized. The failure is not in lack of information but in how it is weighted. When threats are normalized, urgency disappears. The aftermath includes changes in training and policy discussions. Authorities promise better assessment tools and clearer escalation paths. Whether these changes prevent future harm remains a question. The case stands as a benchmark against which future responses are measured. The story lingers because it challenges assumptions about safety. Public spaces feel protective. Systems feel stable. This case shows how both can fail when warning signs are treated as noise rather than signals. What remains is a record of messages that asked for protection and did not receive it. A record of a morning that unfolded despite those messages. And a broader debate about responsibility that extends beyond one individual. If this case made you reflect on how warnings are handled and why some signals are missed, share which moment stood out to you the most. The series ends here, but the questions it raises continue into the conversations that follow.